I came to work for the Defense Logistics Agency in 1975 as a result of a RIF. I originally worked for the Marine Corps in Philadelphia, and after being there about 3 weeks, I was given a RIF notice, which I found very unusual, but it happened nonetheless. And I had 3 choices, and because my father worked for then Defense Supply Agency, I chose to go there. Well, my dad worked for DLA for 30-some years. He began with the Army and was working at the Natick, or rather the Nike sites up through Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And they began to close those sites in the 60s, and he was placed on a reduction in force list. And the choices back then were the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, DISC, which was in the northeast part of the city, or DPSC, as it was known then, in South Philadelphia, and that was the office that he chose. And so he went to work there and worked for 30-some years. It was a beautiful spring day, and I can recall thinking, what a lovely setting, and this is going to be wonderful to work here. And the gentleman who hired me was Jerry Morelli. I still remember that because he was a summer hire to my dad several years prior to that. And so we did all of the paperwork, and he said, well, I'll take you to your office. And we went outside and went across the street, and there was a building that was sort of humming. And you could, as you got closer to this building, the humming sound got much louder. And I thought, well, it must be a power plant or something. I didn't really know what was in that building. But we went in that building, and it became increasingly loud. And that was the clothing factory. And that was my first job, was in the factory doing shipping labels and things of that nature on a manual typewriter, which many people can't probably even remember, but manual typewriter there in a very noisy environment. So that's my earliest memory of work at DLA. Because of the RIF, I came in as a GS2. And so I came to DLA as a clerk typist. And the first job was typing, shipping labels, and what was then referred to as a cutting report, which was this huge matrix that you had to be able to line it all up on a typewriter and go to the end of the column and backspace for the number of numbers. And then if you made a mistake, it was mimeograph paper, so you had to take it out of the typewriter, open it up, scrape off the ink with a little knife that we had. It was quite involved. And so you really didn't want to make any mistakes. I mean, that was kind of the bottom line of that. And then I went on to work in the outer office. I got away from all the noise and hubbub, which was, of course, a big improvement, and then many jobs following that. I would say that by the standards of the day, it was a fairly large clothing factory. There were many clothing factories in Philadelphia at the time as I was growing up in the city, and during the 70s and 80s there began to be a decline in the number of factories because of outsourcing and going to foreign countries for clothing manufacture. I would say that our factory was relatively modern for its time and had the first computerized cutting machine. There would be a pile of fabric, layer by layer of fabric that was a couple of feet high, and this computerized cutting machine would glide over the top of it with whatever pattern they had put into the system and would laser cut the fabric. So it was very advanced for its time. They did a lot of sort of special work, so I can still remember them making parachutes because there was a requirement for parachutes, and the companies that were on contract were unable to meet the delivery schedule. And that's where the factory usually came to the rescue. So they were given the work to make up for this delta, this production delta, and they made a number of parachutes. I remember a lot of the people that worked there in the factory that actually oversaw the sewing operations were people that came from factories there in the city that were able to make men's suits, women's clothing. some very interesting people who were really, artists, really craftsmen at that point in time, who were perfectionists. And so we made a lot of dress uniforms. They made all the special measurement there. And so you never knew when you went out onto the factory floor what you might find being made that day. Well, my very first supervisor was a woman, so at DLA. But honestly, from there on, mostly male supervisors in the early years, and so it was a male-dominated organization. That said, the office environment back then was not cubes, but sort of open office space, and some offices had maybe 4 desks together in a cluster. Others were just lined up in rows. And my recollection was a lot of wires hanging from the ceilings, big adding machines on everyone's desk. We didn't have personal computers back then, and we did use adding machines. I was usually in a contracting office, and so you needed an adding machine to do your job. A lot of noise, a lot of cigarette smoke. One of my memories was of everyone having these big, ugly, orange-yellow glass ashtrays on their desk, all of the smokers, and people smoking, and this kind of cloud by the mid-afternoon, especially in the summer when it was warmer, of cigarette smoke in the office. I started in the clerical series and then was able to parlay that, if you will, into a quasi-buying job. So back then there were some 1,100 series jobs that, if you got the right experience, you would qualify for. And so that was sort of the bridge that I was able to cross. And then I did get an intern job, which was a 579 type of a position in contract policy, which was a wonderful job. And then I applied for a 911 and went to work in the DISMS project office. And that was something that, was not an experience I had had previously. It was working on the first big database system in the Department of Defense, and it was going to be for the Class 1 subsistence food area. And I went there and was selected because I had a contracting background, but I learned a great deal about IT during that time. And I stayed there for quite a while. I believe I was in the DISMS office for about 5 years. That is where I met my future husband. I then went from there back into buying. And so there's a pattern here of sort of going back and forth between contracting and IT, which continued all through my career. And so then I took a number of different positions. I worked in commissary support before the commissary agency was stood up. That was part of DLA, and I worked in that organization with a lot of people that worked very hard day in and day out on making sure that all the commissaries got all of their food. I left that job to go back to medical, which is where I was a clerk many years before, to be a contracting officer, and then went back to subsistence for a contracting officer job, and then went back to medical, and so went back and forth a couple of times between those two areas, and went on from that job to run what was an operations kind of an organization, which was all of the staff elements pulled together in Philadelphia, and got involved with the BRAC, worked on a number of things in the IT realm, and then was asked to come to headquarters on a temporary assignment in the IT world, and eventually applied for the SES that was vacant and came here to headquarters around 1998, and I'm getting ready to depart here in 2012. I would say that I never imagined that I would go from being a clerk to being the vice director. And then my intent was always to go back to school, because I had left school to have my daughter, and my expectation was I would go back and finish school, not go to work. Of course, life is what happens when you're making other plans. And so that didn't work out. And so when it became obvious to me that I was working and not going back to school because I became a single mother, then I began to put the plan together on, okay, if this is it, I'm going to make the most of it. This is a great place to work. I like it here. I really loved the contracting jobs that I had. I adored being in that line of business. And the IT aspects also were very exciting and new to me. So I made a plan and said, I'm going to finish school. Government was willing to pay for it, and laid that out. And as I began to achieve that and finished my undergraduate degree and then went on to get a master's degree, then I would tell you that I may not have had the vice director job in my sights, but certainly Mr. Molino's job in Philadelphia was something I would have thought was an achievable job for me because I was in that contracting realm and electronic commerce. And so I would say by mid-career, I began to put my sights on things that were bigger and better and in the leadership realm. I did not ever really plan to go to the headquarters because, again, I hadn't had the opportunity to experience it. But once I did, it was an eye-opening experience, which is why I've been so vocal about let's get folks down to the headquarters on, temporary assignments. Everyone has a life. People can't just move. But let them have the experience, go to other parts of DLA, see what they do there, take a deployment if you're lucky enough to be able to do that, and get the full experience because there's so much to do in the agency. There's so many important, exciting jobs that you can, aspire to. But if you don't know they're out there or you haven't had that firsthand experience, you're not going to go after them. Okay, so going back to the beginning of my time with DLA, when I think about when I first arrived, I was probably a little oblivious to the fact that, we were drawing down in Vietnam and things were probably changing rapidly in the rest of the agency. But I was originally in the clothing factory. But I do remember that there was a huge hubbub when I went to medical because people were still traveling every day from New York to come to medical because that's where they came from. And then there was also excitement when the subsistence group joined. And that was probably the late 70s or the early 80s. And again, a whole new group of people, many of them from Chicago, who moved their families to come with the mission to work there in Philadelphia. And so I was there for that. Then, of course, I was there for the first database system, which was very exciting, being part of the DISMS group in the 80s. The personal computer, the first email systems. I can remember being part of the test group and exchanging the first emails with, Dan Devincentis as part of a test group in the late 80s. Then prime vendor in the 90s, huge for the agency. And coming out of the Gulf War, the realization that there was so much stuff on the battlefield and people like General Pagonis who still talk about that today, that we had so much stuff that we pushed forward and they didn't know what it was. And when the war ended, stuff that got retrograded back, the eye-opening experience for all the logisticians of we've got to figure out how to do better. Then, of course, the advent of things like JTAV, came about as a result of that in the 90s. And, of course, DLA was a leader in that whole, electronic tagging world. And then all of the electronic commerce things that we did in the 90s, very exciting. I was part of all of that. And then the 2000s, I would say, one of the first things that I wanted to do when I realized the shape that we were in was to replace SAMS. My temporary tour when I came to DLA on a little temporary job was, the big event was 470 some hours of downtime in SAMS. And when I called around to the centers, nobody seemed to care. And I couldn't believe that nobody was concerned about it. And then I found out that the system was in such poor shape that everyone had built little workarounds, little local systems to get around it. And that's what they were using. And so it was a clear mission to take on. Then Y2K underlined it for us when we had people come in and assess the systems and tell us, you're really in poor shape. And you may not even see your systems rise again, the morning after. And you really have got to work hard on all of this. And so I wanted to do that. I thought it was important that we replace our systems. And the early part of the 2000s was spent doing BSM. And that was very difficult, but very rewarding. I mean, to walk around the agency today and recognize that every employee here has got a modernized system, and they're either using DSS or some form of SAP, is really a great thing for the agency. I think it gives us a huge strategic advantage as well. So during Desert Shield, Desert Storm, I was in Philadelphia in the medical commodity, and I was buying, back then, X-ray equipment and what was then called capital equipment. And so things like CAT scanners, X-ray suites for hospitals, nuclear power sources for then medical treatment for cancer and things of that nature. And so there was a huge push during that war to get product out to the battlefield. And we didn't have the technology to do the tagging that we have today, but there was a push. And so a lot of product got pushed to the battlefield. And then, of course, the war was not of long duration. And so when the war ended and we began the process of what we'll call retrograde today, but was not quite retrograde then, it was very apparent that a lot of stuff that got pushed was never got to the intended customer, that it sat in piles because they were overwhelmed, and if it wasn't marked and they could immediately push it for onward movement, it got backed up in a yard somewhere. And I can still remember that we had trailer loads full of things like IV solution that never made it to the intended recipient because of the confusion and the congestion there on the battlefield. And so my role was buying some stuff that needed to go. My big memory was a CT scanner that was a portable unit that they needed right away. And so I was able to get that and push it over. But all of the people that were in the agency at the time, and certainly the folks in Philadelphia, were full speed ahead on food, on medicine, on everything that came from Philadelphia back then to supply the troops for the war. I would say that if anything came about as a result of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, it was a desire to do a better job of total asset visibility. So a few things I believe were born of that. One was JTAV, which was the Joint Total Asset Visibility Program Office, and the system that was later called JTAV, which was an effort to have one system that had visibility over all of the stock worldwide that was either service-owned or DLA-owned. So certainly that was one thing that came out of Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Another that came out of it was, the quest for how do we mark things in a way that makes it easier for people in theater to identify what's in the container. And so RFID tagging really became very important coming out of that war, and trying to find ways to make that a lower cost alternative to marking trailers and tracking trailers. And of course today, we use it for everything going into the AOR, but back then it was a very expensive, shaky kind of technology, didn't always work very well. I mean, it was an emerging technology back then, but I believe the experience of Desert Shield, Desert Storm drove that technology to get to the point that it is at today. So back in the late 80s and early 90s, we were still doing food and medicine the way that we currently buy many repair parts today, meaning everything had a stock number, everything had a specification associated with it. We bought in bulk, and we stored product in the depot system. And so we had huge big bags of flour and sugar. We had aspirin in ugly brown boxes with an NSN stamped on it that we bought in huge quantities. And all of that would get shipped out to the hospitals and the feeding facilities, much the same way as things get shipped to repair depots today. And so I was in medical at the time, in the early 90s, and Sally Bird, who was in charge of supply, would hold meetings on a regular basis to go over back orders and things of that nature. And we would also look at sales from the depot and began to see that there was something wrong, that stuff wasn't moving. And it was not moving in a big way. And the trend continued, and she got very concerned, as we all did, and said, we got to get out there and find out what's going on. And lo and behold, we quickly learned that the Veterans Administration had come up with this structured approach to buying commercial items called prime vendor. And they were stealing our customers from us. So they were out marketing to our hospitals, to DoD hospitals. And the magic of it is you get a commercial item, which all the doctors and nurses would always rather have, the brand name item, than the generic out of the depot system. You got a daily delivery. You ordered today. You got the stuff tomorrow. You didn't have to hold a lot of stock in the back room, so it frees up a lot of space. And there was no surcharge. The Veterans Administration did not charge any kind of a fee for the service. And of course, we always had a cost recovery rate. And when you hold things in the depot, that cost recovery rate can get pretty hefty. So it was pretty high. So we found out what was going on, and we said, okay, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to let them take our business away, or are we going to beat them at their own game? So a small group put their minds down to it. We got copies of their solicitations. We figured out what the business model was. We talked to some of the firms they were doing business with. And within a couple of months of finding out about it, we got a solicitation together and got it on the street. In the meantime, Sally Bird and I went on the road, and we talked to every medical treatment facility, all the leadership, talking about what we were going to do, how it was going to work, made a lot of promises, and then we finally delivered on them. We awarded the pharmaceutical prime vendor contracts and over time got all of those customers back. But it was a significant emotional event in medical to be on the very brink of losing the business. Over the years, I think this is true of many senior executives, but there comes a point in your career where you begin to work longer hours occasionally to get things done. And then I would say by the time I got to be probably a GS 14, there was no such thing any longer as an 8-hour workday. And then, of course, there was the advent of everyone's favorite toy, the BlackBerry, which then puts you on a 24/7 availability kind of a cycle. But, if you think about the agency and the state of the world, we had a short lapse there in the late 90s. But really since 9/11, we've been working around the clock in every location around the world. I can remember the first time that we deployed an answering system, if you will, up in Philadelphia. And we made huge use of this thing. This was before we had BlackBerries and before we really had enough personal computers, or what we today would call a laptop, to be able to give a lot of them out to people. And at the time, we were in the midst of deploying medical prime vendor, and I can still remember how everyone would, no matter what we were doing or where we were going, if we were on the road, the first thing you did was you ran to a phone and you called answering your voicemail, which today it's voicemail, and you got your messages. And we were almost fanatical about it because things were changing rapidly. We were, sort of in a fight for our life. And so I can still remember Sally Bird and I being on the road, and every stop along the way, finding a payphone to dial up our voicemail to see what the latest status was on things. And so, then over time, the cell phone came into existence. And the first ones of those, they were as big as a loaf of bread. Really wasn't very convenient to carry them around. But then, the voicemail system sort of waned in importance because people then had cell phones and BlackBerries and things of that nature. And when you're rolling out a big system like BSM, you've really got to be synchronized and aligned every day. And so we began to gather in the evenings, myself, Ted Case, Larry Wilson, Dave Falvey, Jim Kimberly, and later Paul Peters, Steve Shertock, and we would talk through everything that was happening. And everyone would bring their issues and problems to this meeting, and we began to call it the seance. And it was only us, no one else. And we worked through things, and I believe really created a high-performing organization as a result of that, because even though we often disagreed, we would come to an agreement in those meetings after everyone got to state their position, and we moved forward as a team. And there was never a chink in that armor, which I really believe was part of the reason why we were so successful with BSM. Well, people always ask me, what was it like to be a woman in a male-dominated society or organization or structure such as DOD is? And I think back over the years, and I had a lot of wonderful bosses. And I mean, I can, mostly men in the early years, Dominic Favorito, Joe Totolo. Can you tell I was in South Philadelphia? A lot of great guys, Jim Troilo, people that taught me really how to do the job. And I think that if there was any secret sauce to what made me successful, it was that people were willing to sit down desk side and actually show me how to do things, which I hope we're still doing today. But then I met some very strong women, Kathleen Fitzgerald being the first person that really took an interest in me and, again, took me desk side to show me how to do things and was a great role model. Well, I think that DLA's success lies in a few areas. One would be that people always talk about the Defense Working Capital Fund, and that may seem like something esoteric or, overly technical to some people, but it really is part of the secret sauce that gives DLA a lot of flexibility. And our understanding and knowledge of how to manage that Defense Working Capital Fund has helped us to be very, very successful. So I would say that that's one of the ingredients to the DLA secret sauce. Another is the amount of money that this agency's been willing to invest in technology. I have often said you can make the decision to just, coast and become a legacy provider, or you can become a going concern, meaning you're going to modernize and you're going to keep pace so that you're in business 40 or 50 years from now. And the agency decided to be a going concern. And so we invested about $1 billion. If you look at the whole life cycle of all these technology programs that we've done in the past 15 years, but it's put us way ahead of the pack, arguably still the most successful ERP in all of government. And that is a huge, huge advantage and makes us, I think, gives us big strategic advantage as well. And so our ability and our willingness to invest in the future, I think, is another ingredient for the secret sauce. But then I would say the most important thing is the people. We hire great people, And then we nurture them, we groom them, we train them, we move them around, and they stay. And so I'm sort of an example of, people often say, well, why did you stay so long? Because it was very fulfilling, because it was a great place to work. And as the agency grew, I was able to grow. I was given great opportunities to go back to school, to earn a master's degree, to meet a lot of unbelievable people, to work with some great people, and to do some really big things that in private industry, I may not have gotten that opportunity to implement an ERP or to convince an entire corporate board we should do portfolio management in IT, or to do a lot of the things that over the years I've been able to do. Well, as far as my personal legacy, I'm really not too concerned about, people knowing who Mae Devincentis was. But I looked around as I came into the final, couple of years, and began to think a little bit about what could DLA use to make it even better? What would be something that they don't have now, that others have, and might be good for us? And the thing that I saw was that people like NAVSOP, DAI, DAU, a lot of organizations have created foundations. And the purpose of these foundations is to do good things for the people that work at those organizations. And so they have scholarship funds, they have emergency funds for people who have awful things happen, their house burns down or something bad happens to them. They hold fundraisers, they have socials, they create communications mechanisms to keep people in touch with one another, they have newsletters, they have websites, and so I'm working on a DLA foundation that I hope will live on long beyond May, but I want to get it started, and I'm unable to do a lot with it while I'm still on the rolls, but once I depart, on March the 3rd, my plan is March the 4th to get started on this. And so I'm hoping to get it rolling and to get some other folks that have departed DLA interested in helping, which I know I will be able to do, and to form something that's going to be good for the agency and maybe 50 years from now be as robust as what I've observed some others to be.